Hello, students. This is Professor Gore, and this is part two of the European settlement in North America recorded lecture. And so in the first part, we talked about New Spain. Now we're going to talk about New France, and then we're also going to cover the Dutch and the rise of the mighty Iroquois Confederation and its impact on other Native American groups surrounding them because of the Beaver Wars and the fur trade and so forth. So let's look at where the French first came in North American history. In the 1530s, Jacques Cartier, which I love, that's one of my favorite explorer names, had claimed the lands bordered by the Gulf of St. Lawrence for France. By the 1580s, hundreds of ships from many nations were arriving annually off the coast of Newfoundland, which of course they just called Newfoundland, to catch fish, whales, and seals. In fact, not too far off the coast of Newfoundland is one of the greatest fishing spots in all of world history. It's called the Grand Banks. Tons and tons of cod because of the trillions of plankton that are located there. However, the first permanent settlement came only in 1608, the year after Jamestown, when Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec. And Quebec, my parents have been there. It's a really cool kind of French European style city. Under King Louis XIII, who ruled from about 1610 to 1643, was transferred to the control of the Company of 100 Associates, who agreed to send out 4,000 settlers but fell short. And the Company of 100 was a joint stock company, which is kind of like a 1600s version of a corporation and so forth. In 1662, King Louis XIV, who ruled France for a long time, between 1643 and 1714, turned New France into a royal colony and began subsidizing the migration of indentured servants there. Those who signed indentures would serve a term of 36 months. And we'll see that when the English come, this is going to be a big reason why so many English settlers come over is because of indentured servitude. France did it, but not to the degree that England did. They were also to be paid a yearly salary and eventually receive a leasehold farm, better terms than English indentured servants have for sure. Plus, France didn't quite have the overpopulation and land problems that England did. Even with the famines in France, new French men and women came. One reason was military service by Louis XIV. And so there's not that many men and women that come despite this famine. And it's because Louis XIV forced a lot of the men to serve in his military as he fought a lot of wars in Europe. Also, he prevented the French Huguenots, which are French Calvinist Protestants, from coming over. Had he allowed them to come, they would have escaped by the thousands from religious persecution by the French Catholic dominant population. Of the 27,000 men and women who migrated to New France before 1760, almost two-thirds eventually returned to France, which is kind of interesting. In 1698, the European population of the colony was only about 15,200, where in the English settlements along the eastern seaboard of what becomes the United States, there was about 100,000. So that's a big difference, 15,000 to 100,000. And that'll play into when we get to the 7 Years' War when England wins in North America and France loses. Okay. Lacking settlers, New France became a vast enterprise for acquiring furs, which were in great demand in Europe to make felt hats and fur garments. So let me talk about the fur trade. The fur trade, is it as profitable as the mining of Spain and the gold and silver mines in Central America and South America? No. Is it as prosperous and financially lucrative as a sugar growing of sugar in the Caribbean and Brazil? No. Is it probably as profitable as trading of silk and porcelain and so forth with China? No, but it is very, very financially lucrative, much like tobacco will be as well. And so North America is blessed with lots of mammals that have great soft fur and also waterproof fur. Because it rains a lot, what became all the rage and fashion were these triangular shaped hats that were made from animal skins, and particularly beaver animal skins. You also had marmots and other mammals that otters and so forth that they would skin and then dry out the hides and so forth, and eventually shape them to make these European style hats. And so they were, because beaver pelt is naturally waterproof, it were waterproof hats. And so what's going to end up happening is there's going to be a tremendous demand for furs. And so Native Americans are going to get involved in this. And they're going to be able to trade furs for metal tools, firearms, clothing, European style shoes, and so forth. And the Europeans had a lot of stuff that they wanted. And if they provide the furs, they had something the Europeans wanted, and that would be very profitable. In fact, the first millionaire in American history, the John Jacob Astor, made his money from the fur trade. That tells you how wealthy that was. Also, the French began sitting out these fur traders who would go into the frontier and would oftentimes intermarry with Native American women. And so what that would happen is they would hunt and trap for furs. Their wife, who'd be Native American, would skin the animal and then dry out the hides, and they would have biracial and bilingual children. And so these Coureurs de Bois and their descendants, who also became fur trappers, kind of became like agents of the French crown. And they developed good relations with Native Americans typically. And so that's one of the reasons why France has a better relation with Native Americans than some of the other European powers. Of all the major ones in North America, they had the best relationship with the Native Americans. Here's where some early settlements are. Now, along the eastern seaboard right here, you can see this is where the Pilgrims and Puritans are going to settle. Okay, Pilgrims go right here on Plymouth. Puritans settle everywhere else. Fort Orange, this is where the Dutch are going to settle. Okay, so you got Puritans, Pilgrims, Puritans. French are going to be a lot along here. Of course, the Coureurs de Bois are going to be scattered out. Also, first English settlers come here into the Chesapeake region, Chesapeake Bay, so Jamestown and then up. And then you also have a little bit of a Dutch settlement right here as well, and later a Swedish settlement. And then down here in St. Augustine is where the Spanish were. Jacques Cartier, as I mentioned, first came. Samuel de Champlain is considered the father of New France. One of the things that ends up happening is the Huron Indians looked for an ally, and they found an ally in Samuel de Champlain. He armed them with firearms, and the Hurons were able to face off against their great arch nemesis, the Iroquois Confederation. Because they had firearms, they fired them in a battle against the Iroquois. The Iroquois fled and promised never to flee again. And so that's when it's going to lead the Iroquois to eventually trading with the Dutch and later the English to get firearms to defeat their arch nemesis, the Hurons, who were armed by the French. So by the 7 Years' War, France is going to technically claim all of this. Doesn't mean they're settled and all that. And they're not near the population that the English colonies are going to have. England's going to claim all this. Of course, this will be disputed. Hudson Bay Company, Joint Stock Company, claims this area for fishing and whaling, but really it's just frozen wasteland for a chunk of the year. Now there's a bunch of oil up there. Russia's up here, kind of doing their thing. New Spain having presidios, military forts down here, and of course in Florida. So fishing is something that French fishermen have been doing for centuries. And it's actually theorized that French fishermen had found the Grand Banks even potentially before Columbus, but didn't tell anybody because they didn't want anybody to know about their fishing gold mine at the Grand Banks. And so just one thing to keep in mind is that few French men and women have come because of King Louis XIV's policy. Had they allowed French Protestants or French Huguenots to come, they would have came in large numbers. But the fur trade is how France becomes successful. Here's how I remember: France furs, France furs, furs France. Okay, the Dutch did a fur trade as well, so did the English. But France, the reason why they're successful in Canada is because of the fur trade. Okay. Also, Jacques Marquette explores the Mississippi River all the way down to New Orleans, which is actually originally a French settlement. He explored part of it, and then Robert de La Salle came in 1681 and followed all the way to the Gulf of Mexico and then sailed back around. And so France is going to create some settlements along the Mississippi River, like New Orleans, like Natchez, Mississippi, like Arkansas Post in Arkansas, St. Louis, Des Moines, Iowa. And this is where they called it Louisiana, land of Louis, who was the king at the time, Louis XIV. Okay. Now here is King Louis XIV with his rocking hair, looked like a boss back then. And here is what Quebec. You can see these are very old European style places, but they're beautiful. My parents love Quebec. This is where it primarily was on this little peninsula area. And later there's going to be a famous battle, one of the most important battles in North American history, called the Battle of Quebec, fought on the Plain of Abraham. Here's Samuel de Champlain, who rocked a really cool facial hair setup here. And so befriended the Huron Indians, but ends up leading them conflict with the Iroquois. So at its height, at about the 7 Years' War mark, what we later call the French Indian War in American history, It's about 75,000. Okay. And it wasn't necessarily owned by an individual company. It was a royal colony. So therefore, there's not this indentured servanthood enticement as much as England. Now, they did have indentured servants, which had a better deal than English settlers, but they're not going to attract near as many settlers, partly because Louis XIV's forced military service. Okay. And so you can see right here another map to show where they settled. You can see these French settlements right here along the Mississippi River. Settle a little bit around the Great Lakes, but mostly they're right up here. Most of the farming they do is right here along the St. Lawrence River Valley. Okay, so I remember I've already talked about Coureurs de Bois, it means runners of the wood. They intermarried and kind of became ambassadors to the French crown. Some of the Coureurs de Bois are not great and are kind of not the best social skills and can create some damaging relationships. The Jesuit priests come in and try to repair those relationships. And then the Jesuit priests go and live amongst the Native Americans. Some tribes aren't too kind to the Jesuits. They skin some alive, according to historical record. But most of them allow them to come live with them, and they try to convert them to Christianity. You also have Antoine Cadillac, who founded Detroit, a very important fort on the Great Lakes. Later, it's going to be part of Michigan, but we'll talk about how that fort is going to be a source of tension after the American Revolution. And New Orleans was founded in 1718. Okay, so what was France's most valuable resource? It is lots of beaver in their lands for that fur trade. Okay, so that's very, very important. Now let's talk about the rise of the most powerful Indian confederation in U.S. history. The French, even though they had better relationships with Native Americans, brought diseases that killed 25 to 90% of Indian peoples. It's not as bad as the Spanish. Although that 90% rate and that particular tribe was bad, but still not the 97% death rate in the Caribbean that Spanish brought. This sparked a series of deadly wars by bartering guns for furs. And because of their location in central New York, the Iroquois could obtain guns and goods from the Dutch merchants in Albany and quickly attack other Indian peoples by water because they would canoe down rivers. The Iroquois warriors moved to the east along the Mohawk River as far as New England, and south along the Delaware and Susquehanna rivers as far as the Carolinas. They traveled north via Lake Champlain and Richelieu River to Quebec, and they journeyed west via the Great Lakes and Allegheny, Ohio River system to exploit the rich fur-bearing lands of the upper Mississippi River Valley. The rise of the Iroquois was breathtakingly rapid, just as their subsequent decline was tragically sobering. In 1600, the Iroquois numbered about 30,000 and lived in large towns of 500 to 2,000 inhabitants. Over the next 2 decades, they organized themselves in a confederation of 5 nations, which was the Senecas, Cayugas, Onondagas, Oneidas, and the Mohawks, which the Mohawk haircut is pretty famous. Partly in response to a virulent smallpox epidemic in 1633, which cut their numbers by a third, the Iroquois waged a devastating series of wars against the Hurons in 1649, okay, and then against the Neutrals. Yes, that actually was a tribe. They fought against them in 1651, the Eries, which is where Lake Erie gets its name from, in 1657, and the Susquehannocks, all Iroquois-speaking peoples. They razed their villages and killed most of the men, cooking and eating their flesh to gain access to their spiritual powers. Yes, they did commit cannibalism. They took thousands of women and children as captives. Okay, and this is where some of the tribes that they fought against. The Iroquois right here. Okay, they fought the Susquehannocks, the Eries, and other tribes. This is where the Mohicans were. The famous book Last Mohicans was written about. And so they did take thousands of women and children as captives, adopting them into Iroquois lineages and clans and formal ceremonies. The Hurons simply ceased to exist as a distinct people and culture. Those who survived the Iroquois raids migrated westward and joined other remnant people to form a new tribe called the Wyandots. And the Wyandots are later going to join forces with Little Turtle, who was a chief and fight against the Americans after the American Revolution. These tribes gave the Iroquois control of the fur trade with the French in Quebec and the Dutch in New Amsterdam. The Iroquois also had to adopt prisoners to make up as much as half of the population in many of their communities. So they also captured a lot of English settlers and some French settlers. I had to read a book in graduate school about this young girl who was captured when they attacked this town in western Massachusetts, and her father spent the rest of his life trying to find her, and actually was able to track her down. And she had married a Iroquois man, and he was able to kind of establish a relationship with her new husband, and their children later in life. But his wife and a couple of her sisters were killed in the attack, and so forth. She was captured at like the age of 6. So one of the things that happened is cultural diversity within the Confederacy increased further when the Five Nations made peace with the French to allow Jesuit missionaries to live among them. Eventually, the Christian natives moved to French-sponsored mission towns, while the tradition-minded Iroquois took control of the Five Nations. In the 1670s, the Iroquois made the covenant chain with the English while severing their ties with the French. And they're eventually going to fight on behalf of the French, on behalf of the English in the 7 Years' War, the French-Indian War, and then later on behalf of the British in the American Revolution. Okay. One of the things, too, is they were sinking furs to sell to merchants in Albany. They embarked on a new series of Western Beaver Wars. Iroquois warriors pushed a dozen of Algonquin-speaking peoples allied with the French, like the Ottawas, Foxes, Sacs, Kickapoos, Miamis, and Illinois, out of their traditional lands north of the Ohio River and into a multi-tribal region west of Lake Michigan in present-day Wisconsin. The Iroquois victory came at a high cost. More than 2,200 warriors dead. And to end the bloodshed in 1701, the Iroquois made treaties with the French as well as the English, a diplomatic maneuver that brought peace for 2 generations. So they were very much a warlike people, and I want to emphasize that. And so what you end up having is you have these rivalries already taking place between Native American people. But when the Europeans arrived to get the goods that they want, it increased already warlike tension that because these tribes fought against each other and so forth, and before the Europeans arrived, but it increased that intensity. And so the Europeans aren't solely to blame for that. They made their own choices, but nonetheless, it definitely this interaction with Europeans to get their goods, call it greed, call it what you want, does intensify Native American conflict. And you can see right here in their second Beaver Wars, they fought against these people right here. So the poor Hurons get driven to west of the Great Lakes, and they become this new tribe called the Wyandots. But they would attack settlements in this region and so forth. And the neutrals are right here. So tough way to go. All right. Let's talk about the Jesuit missions. The Jesuits, like I mentioned, lived among the Native Americans. They weren't like the Franciscan order of the Spanish who tried to get the Native Americans to come live with them in their presidios. They first sought converts among the Hurons and then among their Iroquois conquerors. And these Jesuits were part of this Catholic order called the Society of Jesus. But it was a Catholic religious order founded to combat the Protestant Reformation. So it's part of the Catholic Reformation. Between 1625 and 1763, hundreds of French Jesuits lived among the Indian peoples of the Great Lakes region. These priests came to understand and respect the Indians' values, at least better than the Spanish did. In the face of epidemics and drought, some Indian peoples vented their anger on French missionaries and fur traders. The Jesuits did not exploit the labor of the Indian peoples where the Spanish did. Moreover, they tried to keep brandy, which wreaked havoc from the natives, from becoming a bargaining chip in the French fur trade. So they try to keep the Coureur de Bois from bringing alcohol. Finally, the Jesuits won converts by adopting Christian beliefs to the Indians' needs. Still, despite the Jesuits' efforts, the French fur trading system brought cultural devastation to the Indian peoples of, around the Great Lakes and so forth. And epidemics killed tens of thousands. Now, obviously, when the Jesuits brought in disease, were they intentional bringing disease? No. They would just traveled with them and so forth. And the Native Americans didn't have that resistance to those big civilization killers like smallpox. Also, so you have a combination of disease and Iroquois warriors murdering thousands more. The Iroquois didn't escape unscathed either. And in 1666 and again in 1690, French armies invaded their land, burned villages and cornfields, and killed many warriors for their attacks on French settlements and also other native groups. All right. Last topic for this part is let's talk about the Dutch, New Netherlands. By 1600, Holland had emerged as the financial and commercial hub of Northern Europe. They had gained independence from Spain, and they become really a dominant country in banking and also commerce. They had a big merchant fleet, merchant marine, so a bunch of ships. In addition, the Dutch entrepreneurs dominated not only banking, but also the early insurance industry, textile industries, and its merchants owned more tons of shipping and employed more sailors than the combined fleets of England, France, and Spain. So the Dutch had got it going on back then. Okay. They also seized Portuguese forts in Africa, Brazil, and Indonesia, which gave them control of the Atlantic trade in slaves and Indian Ocean commerce and East Indies spices and Chinese silks. Henry Hudson was sent to find a new supply of North America in 1609. So it was a Dutch uh, uh, joint stock company. He explored the Hudson River and established Fort Orange, which became Albany, New York, as a fur trading post. And in 1621, the Dutch government chartered the West India Company and gave it a monopoly over the American fur trade and the West African slave trade. Now, there was also a Dutch East India Company called the VOC. It's actually the oldest corporation in world history. It's still around today. And so 3 years later, after they got involved in the West African slave trade, the company founded the town of New Amsterdam on Manhattan Island and made it the capital of New Netherland. The new colony did not thrive. Few Dutch settlers moved to the fur trading posts, which made them vulnerable to rival European nations. Plus, they could make more money in other parts of their empire. The company did grant huge estates along the Hudson River to wealthy Dutchmen, but they had to bring about 50 tenants on the land within 4 years or lose it. Although the colony failed to attract settlers, it flourished as a fur trading enterprise. They established good trading relations with the Iroquois, but they seized prime farming land from the Algonquin-speaking neighbors. In the 1640s, in a bloody 2-year war with the Algonquins, more than 200 Dutch residents and 1,000 Indians died, many of them women and children. The West India Company largely ignored the West India Company largely ignored New Netherland and focused elsewhere. They alienated the diverse population of Dutch, English, and Swedish migrants. And eventually in 1664, the Duke of York took over and seized the colony for England. The reason why a few resisted is because they weren't getting a lot of food, and the Iroquois kind of kept them captives in their own fort. Okay. Henry Hudson and so forth on the Hudson River and also along the Hudson Bay. Okay. So it did have aristocratic influence. Did have a diverse population because they had Dutch, English, Swedish settlers, and so forth. In fact, one observer observed there was 18 different languages spoken. It's fitting because New York, which is later what they call it, ended up becoming the most diverse city in U.S. history. So this is where they settled. And so a few settlers come and eventually gets conquered without firing a shot. The Duke of York got New Netherland to surrender, and after about 50 years of existence, and it becomes an English colony. All right, and we'll come back to the English colonial settlements in Jamestown, the Chesapeake region, in the next part, and then we'll cover the Pilgrims and the Puritans in the last part.